So, hello everybody. My name is Martin Vaux, and I am in Sussex, in southern England, so near Brighton, south of London. It's the evening here, so it's just gone 7 p.m. As you can see, the sun is starting to go down. And today is Midsummer's Day, which might not mean anything to you, but if it does, then you'll be well aware of these facts. This is the longest day of the year, i.e., it's the day when the sun is up for the longest time during the year. We might come back to that salient fact a little bit later. Now, I'm just going to share this presentation and talk over the top of it. So hopefully everyone can see this okay. I'm just going to try and send it full screen. There we go. So today we're talking about dragons. And I've called the presentation and our talk an introduction to dragons because dragons is a huge topic, absolutely enormous. And it's rare to find a culture on the planet that doesn't have some form of dragon story. So what we're going to do is try and narrow our thoughts down into the kind of traditional medieval dragon. And just looking at this particular image, you can already see that actually it's made up of lots of different parts of other animals, which is one of the unique features of the dragon, quite why we will explore. Now, this is my podcast, Three Ravens. We talk about English, myth, and folklore. And I was contacted by the lovely people at Arrow because someone had listened to the podcast and went, "Oh my goodness, you've got an episode about dragons. This is very exciting. Come and talk to our communities about dragons." So, of course, I'm very happy to. And this is a photograph of me with slightly shorter hair. Do I need a trim? I don't know if I need a trim. I'm liking it long. But anyway, this is me with a slightly shorter haircut, and my lovely partner Eleanor, who's my co-host on the podcast and my partner in real life. We are right there at Old Sarum, which is one of the old capitals of England from ancient times. And behind us, you can see the ruins of Salisbury Cathedral. And you might, if you know anything about English history, go, but Salisbury already has a cathedral. Yes, but it used to be on top of this hill called Old Sarum. And they moved the entire cathedral into town because on top of the fort hill where this capital had been, there wasn't any water, basically, so they couldn't support the community. So they evacuated this old fort, Old Sarum. Very interesting place, but anyway, there we are. So let's start with the first image we have of a dragon created in England. And there that dragon is, a handsome chap, I think you'll agree. This image illustrated by a monk in an illuminated manuscript in 1260. It's in a manuscript called the Harley Manuscript, which is a bestiary. So it's full of all different types of creatures. And when we look at this image, we can see a lot of the things that we'd expect from a medieval dragon, such as wings, of course, and 4 legs. Now, there's a lot of different conversations we could have about different types of dragon. And if you look at art of dragons from just this point in history, so we're talking about the 13th century, we're already in a place where we've got lots of different weird things that are quite dragon-y. So on the left-hand side there, we've got a wyvern. This one has a person's face. At the top, we've got something called a jaculus, which is a dragon that has no limbs at all, whereas the wyvern only has 1 set of legs, but it has wings. And then we've got the cockatrice that's being nibbled on by a strange little creature you might be able to see. I'll talk a bit more about why he's being nibbled by that creature there. But we've got lots of different weird bits of animal combined together in the same way that we have combined in dragons in the previous image, the one that started this presentation. Now, in terms of the dates we can attach to these various different images, we've got our wyvern is from the choir stalls in Chester Cathedral. That's 1380 AD, that one was carved. 12th century bestiary from Norwich, known as the Neville manuscript, is the source of our jaculus. And then we have got a 1400-ish, around 1400, we have got this image from the Anne Walsh bestiary. Anne Walsh, very interesting lady in the 1400s. She was just a woman who was given a Latin text full of all these different creatures, and she did illustrations of each and every one. And today we can look back at what a lot of medieval people thought animals look like and look at Anne Walsh's bestiary and get some really beautiful illustrations from a woman, which is a very unusual thing for this point in history. But things are getting confusing already. We've got dragons, we've got wyverns, we've got the jaculus, which is a kind of wyvern. We've also got our cockatrice. And then we've got these things called basilisks, which you might be familiar with from the likes of Harry Potter. And what's really strange is, if you look at medieval texts, descriptions of a basilisk and descriptions of a cockatrice are absolutely identical. They're actually the same creature. They're both kinds of dragon. Why are basilisks and cockatrice the same then and different now? You might think there's some kind of strange discovery of different species made at some point between the medieval era and now. It's nothing as complicated, friends. It's actually because of Dungeons and Dragons, which you might find ridiculous, but actually the Dungeons and Dragons first edition, published in 1974, sets out in its monster manual that you can see there a series of different monsters that you can battle against in this dice and tabletop kind of board game, really, Dungeons and Dragons. And you can see there we've got a dragon on the front cover, but we've also got centaurs and unicorns. We have a griffin up there, and also some sort of deadly caterpillar, I presume. But the point is that it isn't until Dungeons and Dragons and the Dungeons and Dragons monster manual that basilisks and cockatrice are given different characteristics when they're split out and they start to become more defined. It's because of a fantasy game, which might seem surreal, but there it is. And when it comes to dragons, of course, there's loads of pop culture dragons, those from George R.R. Martin's book series and things like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. We've got Smaug, famously from J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth books, and dragons have played important roles in folklore and literature, such as in Beowulf, which is the very first piece of English literature where the big climax is a battle with a dragon. Now, today we can draw distinctions between your classic dragons with 4 legs and wings, with the power to potentially breathe fire or poison, and other dragons like wyverns and the other ones that we've talked about. Now, we might think about this basilisk and this cockatrice as particularly interesting and dangerous because they were known to petrify people, to turn them to stone. And in some mythology, this is through a look. So you could be looked at by a cockatrice or looked at by a basilisk, and they would turn you to stone. And in some stories, you are bitten by a cockatrice or basilisk and turned into stone. How that relates to the broader story of dragons, again, we will come back to. But the point is, at this key point in history, really, before the 11th century, we have lots and lots of synonyms, lots and lots of the same word for the same thing, which puts us in an awkward position. Because here we are today, there's a mess of dragony type creatures. What do we do about this problem? Well, my solution was to go back to the ancient past to try and find the very first references to dragons. Okay, so we're moving away from all of this lot, the cockatrice, the jaculus, the basilisk, the wyvern. We will return to them. But now we are heading to the very first language, which is cuneiform. And you may already know this, but cuneiform is this pictorial language. You can see it's made up of a series of different glyphs and symbols. We often find cuneiform tablets. They're about hand size. The language originally developed as a kind of form of receipts. So to make sure that in your trade deals, things were going well. Where did cuneiform first develop? Well, cuneiform developed in ancient Mesopotamia. So it emerged around 3,300 BC. So that is over 5,000 years ago. And it was used in ancient Mesopotamia, in cultures like the Sumerian and Babylonian cultures. Why does this matter to us? And where the heck is ancient Mesopotamia? Well, we would call these territories today Iraq. And this is an important cradle of civilization, it's literally known as, because this is the first place where we get the very first cities, the first times people come together, starting to live together in extended communities, get city walls, and we also get this bubble of culture where culture seems to coalesce and intensify. And this here is a remnant of ancient Mesopotamia. This is the Ishtar Gate. It's currently housed at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. It was excavated by a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey, who in 1904 excavated and reconstructed the Ishtar Gate because, of course, we don't talk about Mesopotamians anymore. Their empire had long fallen, and the Ishtar Gate was buried deep underground. But here it is, striking blue with its bricks there, the blue symbolic of lapis lazuli, which is a really important gemstone in the ancient world with magical properties. But you will notice across the surface of the Ishtar Gate, there is repeated patterns, okay? Repeated patterns of these creatures. There are 3 different creatures repeated over and over again. Why? What's the significance? Because the Ishtar Gate is the way into Babylon. It is the glorious entry to the city. It's trying to make the biggest impression possible. It's built by King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, these creatures are, firstly, Ishtar is the goddess of love. She's kind of the progenitor goddess to Aphrodite or Venus of classical myths, so the god of love, god of fertility, sometimes a god of war also, Ishtar, a very interesting one. She's represented by the auroch, so an ancient type of cow. Then there is the god Adad. He is the god of the sun, and he's represented by a lion. Then we have the last figure, this last icon, this last sigil or herald, representing Marduk, who is the sky god. He is the conqueror of the old gods. And what's he represented by? The first, what we might call, Western dragon. This is Muskuzu. And of course, his name has all these weird little signs and symbols around it, which means it's complicated to say. But Muskuzu, he is a hybrid demon creature whose name translates as the red snake. Now here he is. Muskuzu can fly, which is a pretty handy thing if you're going to be a dragon. And much like later chimera type descriptions of the cockatrice or basilisk, he has a big snake's tongue, which you can see there poking out. He also has scales covering his body, but he has lion-like forearms and eagle-like back legs. Yes, he has talons on those, and his skin, like I say, it's been covered in fish-like scales in these ancient cuneiform texts that we've been able to translate. So between all of that, the snake's head and tongue, the lion and eagle-like legs with talons and claws covered with scales, well, in my mind, you've got something very close to our modern idea of a dragon. Now, Muskuzu did not breathe fire, but significantly, the ancient Babylonians named the constellation that we call Hydra after Muskuzu. So even back then, the Hydra constellation was associated with a whacking great big snake. Of course, the Hydra is also a big snake from mythology, the one with lots and lots of heads. And the mythology behind Muskuzu is he was originally ruled over by the ancient god of agriculture, whose name was Ningishzida, and he was one of 3 dragons, all born from 3 snaking rivers in Mesopotamia, and those are the 2 branches of the Tigris and Euphrates. So here is a map. So in modern-day Iraq, we have these different branching rivers, and effectively the dragons are the rivers in the mythology. Now, one of these 3 dragons was Bashmu, known as the venomous snake. Another was Ushumgalu, and he was called the great snake. And then you had Muskuzu, the red snake, or in an alternate translation, the fierce snake. And originally, all three were made by Tiamat, the goddess of the sea. But before long, during the rising of the new gods, which is very similar to stories like Zeus's rebellion against the Titan Kronos, if you know your ancient Greek or Roman mythology, Marduk, the sky god, slayed Tiamat, turning her ribs into the vault of the sky. Then Nergal, the ancient Mesopotamian god of death, he then, and he's kind of like your Hades or Pluto equivalent, he slays Bashmu. Then Marduk's son, Nabu, the god of wisdom and art, kind of the Mercury of the Mesopotamian pantheon, slays Ushumgalu. But rather than killing Muskzuzi, Marduk subdues him and keeps him as his servant. So all three of those primal dragons were also said to have horns. We can see there in the bottom left, we have another picture of an ancient sculpture of Muskzuzi's head. And they also described these dragons as being 60 double miles long, so 120 miles long each, which makes Muskzuzi a very big dragon. But was Muskzuzi the first dragon? Is that where the dragon story begins? You're thinking, probably not, otherwise you wouldn't have asked us the question. Fair enough. So the oldest records we have of dragons come from the Far East, and they actually come from China, and they look like this. And you look at that and you go, doesn't look terribly dragony to me. But to get a sense of how old these dragons are, if you think back to ancient Mesopotamia and the Muskzuzi legends and art, all that is at the most 6,000 years old, at the absolute extremes, which is very old. But the oldest evidence of Chinese dragon carvings, like this one, they date back over 8,000 years. So it may well be that Chinese dragons are the oldest dragons of all. They are certainly the oldest ones we have found to date. Now, we have no writing at all about them, because even if these myths were written down, China is the first nation to discover paper. They write everything down on paper, whereas we in the West, particularly in England and Northern Europe, we use parchment. What's the difference? Why would this matter? Well, parchment is made of skin, so goat skin and sheep skin, things like that, carefully treated, and it lasts forever, whereas paper rots. So if there was any old legends or mythology or kind of logic behind the dragon from that long ago, then alas, it would have all decayed and disappeared. Still, the very early dragons, sort of carvings like this one that we have in China, they're sometimes known as pig dragons because they look a little bit like pigs. Modern archaeology tends to associate pig dragons with fetal imagery, so like, unborn children. So there's a kind of sacred and holy aspect to the dragon as a creature. It kind of represents new life to the Chinese at this ancient point in time. We don't know for sure, this is speculative. But we do know that these pig dragon statues, about 8,000 years old, they started with their swirly design to feed into early swirly letters in the Chinese language. And we also have early dragon amulets and coiled jewelry. So that's pretty interesting. How might this idea of the dragon then connect to life in the Middle East and beyond from there? Well, we know, and this is amazing, it kind of blows my mind, but from the 10th millennium BC, so over 12,000 years ago, we had the beginnings of what is known as the Silk Road, okay? This is a map showing you the Silk Road. And this was a trade route that we know stretched from what's now China into the Middle East and into Africa. The earliest records of this trade is in things like obsidian, so a precious gem, in spices and in other precious stones. And of course, as time went on and maritime trade, so sea trade developed, we get tons of different goods moving around between, of course, in the Mediterranean, Greece and Rome through the Red Sea, but through to India and China and beyond. And the ancient Egyptians wrote quite a bit about the things that they were trading. So we have quite good records, as did a lot of other cultures along the Silk Road route. And we know from Barrow tombs in England that trade for tin in particular made Cornwall and the southwest of England a hugely important trade destination. Discoveries like the Amesbury Archer, for example, he dates from around 2300 BC and was found near Stonehenge. Now we're looping back to the idea of Stonehenge and midsummer, because we know that midsummer, the special day, the longest day of the year, was the time that people used to gather at monuments like Stonehenge for big celebrations and also for big trade events. So it functioned a bit like a marketplace, Stonehenge. People could see it from miles around. They knew where to head. And so you'd have multi-day festivals around events like midsummer and midwinter, changes of the seasons, which would draw people from all across the world. So the Amesbury Archer, who's buried not far from Stonehenge, we actually know he comes from the Alps. So he's not an English person. So he's traveled all the way across the sea, across Europe, trading goods. And in his grave goods, just his alone, and we have lots of Barrow tombs of buried, rich people, sometimes kings, sometimes not. This trade for tin saw things like wrist guards that people used to wear, and as well as gold and silver and other precious stones. They'd come from as far as ancient Egypt or the Caucasus Mountains, which stretch from Europe into Asia. The theory is, people would come from all these far off places, and you can see that green line, that's the initial sort of ground trade routes people used to do by foot, and then the red lines are extending into sea trade and trade by boat. So there's no doubt, basically, that the idea of dragons was moving around through the ancient world before we even have a written record. And so when we start to get our first stories of dragons in the ancient world, it's important to understand that, considering trade with China, these myths of serpentine creatures had almost certainly been in the human cultural mix for thousands of years already. Now, and in case you're wondering, how do I ground myself? That's where ancient Mesopotamia is, right? So you can see that's where Iraq is today, but that's where ancient Mesopotamia is and was. Okay, so people coming from China all over the ancient world, and the heart of it, this coalescing first real empire, first real civilization, is happening right there. The other key civilization at this point in time, of course, is in ancient Egypt, where we start to get our first dragon legends there from about 3500 BC. Okay, and some people say that Musuzu isn't the first ever dragon. It's actually this character. Now, the very earliest records we have that make an argument this is a dragon, they look like this. So you can see there a snake symbol stabbed with a series of daggers. Okay, and this icon describes Apep, who is the ancient Egyptian embodiment of chaos. So at the dawn of time, Apep was there. He was the chaos bringer, the chaos agent, you might call him. He was a sort of male primal force of darkness and disorder, with his opponent being Mart, the female primal force of light and justice. And art of Apep predates any writing about him. He's only written about quite sparingly from about 4,000 years ago. And in terms of Apep and Mart, they're binary opposites, and Apep specifically is described as still being pretty big as snaky type serpentine dragons go. He's meant to be 16 yards long. So, so they were roughly as long as a house, you might say, a sort of average suburban dwelling, perhaps. So intimidating against the scale of a human. But the important thing about Apep is that's him in his resting state. He was capable of growing much larger when the need called for it. Legend says that he lived in the space just beyond sunrise and sunset. So he lived constantly in the dark, and he's always out of view, but always there. And it was believed that he could lengthen out to encircle the whole world, squeezing it to cause earthquakes. That was the ancient Egyptians' explanation for how earthquakes came about. It was the world being squeezed by a giant chaos snake, which I think is just wonderful. Now, Apep is described as having a head made of flint, which is suitably strange, and he was a bad luck deity, sort of the universal bogeyman of the earliest Egyptian myths, including the pyramid texts and the coffin texts. He's often at war with sun gods like Ra and Osiris, who sometimes take animal forms such as a mongoose or a cat or a jackal. And so we get some papyrus art like this, with nasty old Apep being fought by these deities. Now, around this time, we get this trend of all sorts of religions around the Middle East and Mediterranean Sea of superior sky gods conquering chaotic snake-like dragon enemies often born from the sea, which in the ancient world was thought of as chaos, the ocean, and also as a key cradle of life. Legends like, for example, Hercules here with his mighty club battling the Hydra, but there are tons of these. So this is about 3,000 years ago. You get all of these myths that happen almost simultaneously. So you've got Marduk subduing Murzizou, that happens kind of first. Then you've got Apollo slaying Python, which of course is where we get the term python from, those very big snakes found in the tropics, named in 1803 by a French explorer. But in terms of that story, loads of versions. For example, the story of the Akkadian and Syrian gods Hadad and Baal defeating the dragons Lotan and Temtum. The Hittite god Tarhuns defeating the dragon Iluyanka. Zeus defeating the 100-headed dragon Typhon. The Hebrew god Yahweh defeating Leviathan. Now, that last one is very important. And here we have a very early engraving of Behemoth and Leviathan. Now, Leviathan is a really, really primal and important person or character in the story of dragon mythology. She first appears in the Hebrew Bible, which is starting to come together around 500 BC, so over 2,500 years ago. And that contains the story of Yahweh, or God's defeat of Leviathan. And Leviathan, as we understand the idea now, is said to be a female dragon, a sea monster created at the dawn of time, along with Behemoth, the male chaos beast, who's a bit more like a vast hippopotamus in the early descriptions we have. And Behemoth represents the dry earth and deserts, while Leviathan represents the sea. And it's said that at the end of time, Leviathan and Behemoth will fight, as described in the book of Revelations. The land and the sea will be at war, basically. So we're talking about metaphors, probably. But, this is early faith taken very, very seriously. And in terms of Leviathan specifically, she's supposed to be, check this out, 300 miles long. And in her, we get the final essential ingredient of modern dragons, because Leviathan can breathe fire. Okay? Now, following those days of early Judaism and the birth of Christianity, we of course see the collapse of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Dark Ages. Why are they called the Dark Ages? Well, because the historical record goes dark, right? Literature becomes very scarce indeed. And when the lights begin to come back on again, we find a lot of writing written by Christian monks, okay? The same people who wrote down texts like Beowulf around the 10th century. And in their work, we see a new version of the old dragon story emerging. This here is a famous painting of St. George and the Dragon, who I hope you've heard of. I hope you've heard of this story, but you might not, as you're people who live in America. If you're English, it's a very important story, St. George and the Dragon. St. George is the patron saint of England. And here he is slaying a dragon, representing by now Satan and sin. He's rescuing a princess in the Middle East. And so we have an adaptation of that old tale. Instead of, say, Hercules as a demigod, we now have saints and local heroes like King Arthur or St. Matilda or St. Patrick, all defeating and casting out serpentine dragon-like foes. Okay? And at this point, monks are really the only people who can write in society. If you're very, very rich, if you're a noble, you might have a monk educate you in how to write. But fundamentally, it is the monks that are putting the books together. And, I don't know about you, but I love all of these old illustrations that were done to illuminate manuscripts, to bring some of these texts to life. And in terms of what these monks wrote down, it wasn't all the Gospels being copied out again and again and again. So we get lots of translations of old travel logs from adventurers. We get Greek and Latin texts, collections of old stories from other places. But very often, all of this is filtered through a Christian lens. So they apply Christian language and Christian ideas on, and all the stories end up slightly tweaked to fit with their monkish business. So on the right-hand side there, you can see a story of some men who allegedly found an island and made a camp there and lit a fire. And then all of a sudden, the island they were on woke up, and it was Leviathan that they were on top of, according to this story. Okay, and that is a folk tale that recurs over and over again. It happens in Japan, as well as happening in England and Ireland and all over Europe. But you can see what I mean. You've got these monks, they're slightly editing, or slightly tweaking their stories to make them fit. And when you look at that picture, you don't necessarily think, that looks like a dragon to me in the modern concept of a dragon, but they're using what they know. They're trying their best to piece something together. And so the languages that they are working in is where a lot of issues come from when we're talking about the distinction between a dragon and, a jaculus and a werum and a basilisk and a cockatrice and all these sorts of things. Because normally what they're working in as a language is Latin. The word dragon itself is a great example. That word comes to England along with a lot of other outstanding Norman French innovations via the French word dragon. And all dragon means in Old French is huge serpent, okay? And that ancient French word in turn has its roots in ancient Greek and Latin, specifically the term Draco, which wasn't necessarily used to refer to a mythical creature, but rather the word Draco was used in the classical world to describe any kind of snake. Okay, so Draco into dragon into dragon, what we're really talking about is snakes all the way, which kind of deromanticizes them for us in a little way. In fact, there are even older words than Draco, such as the Sanskrit word dross and Indo-European word derko, which are actually to do with sight and the eyes rather than to do with anything else. And from this, we can understand that actually the most ancient terms for dragons grew out of words for huge serpents and their eyes. And that leads to terms like dyrkomai in ancient Greek, meaning I see. And interestingly, terms for dragon, basilisk, and cockatrice are all used interchangeably, including in the 14th century Wycliffe Bible. So when it came to translating the Wycliffe Bible in terms of using words like serpents, asps, and adders, which you might find if you pick up a copy of the King James or an even more modern Bible. But actually at the time, it was perfectly acceptable to use all of these different terms just for sentence variety, because why not? It's fun. We can't use the same word over and over again, can we? Thinks these monks using their imagination, illuminating their manuscripts and drawing all of these beautiful and quite strange things. Now, Wycliffe, in terms of his translation of the Bible, in his version, he took the idea of a dragon from a description in Pliny, so an ancient Greek writer, in his natural history dating from about 79 AD, when Pliny describes how a mongoose is the natural enemy of a dragon. Pliny himself took that idea from ancient descriptions of Apep being defeated by Ra and Osiris in their animal forms. Then when you start to think about what a cockatrice looks like, there he is being bitten by, what's a mongoose? I don't know. Do we have anything like it in England? It's a bit like a weasel, perhaps? Well, that's how we end up with this idea that cockatrices are particularly vulnerable to weasels, which is a common belief in England through the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. But also you can start to see how you've ended up with these weird descriptions of creatures with, say, lion-like forearms and eagle-like back legs with talons. And if they can fly, well, the only things that can fly have wings. So we better start adding wings into all of our drawings of these weird creatures. Okay. And, as mentioned, the cockatrice and basilisk, these horrible serpents, they have the power to turn people to stone. The logical association of people being so scared of them, of these huge serpents, that they'd be frozen rigid, kind of makes sense. And we see these ideas repeated in other mythical creatures like the Gorgon Medusa with her hair made of snakes, who also turned people to stone. But most commonly, we think of this metaphor in relation to being poisoned by a snake. We can imagine how if someone's found having encountered a snake, having been injected with snake venom in the ancient world, they very well could have turned rigid because of the effects of that venom and become effectively petrified. Okay.
If the shift is going to put them into overtime, you can deny it, so then it won't result in excessive.
Okay, and then in terms of the medieval era being this important point in the history of England, this is in no small part because of the Norman invasion of 1066, where an enormous conquering force arrived from Norman France, bringing a new wave of Christianity and a whole new way of arranging power to England. And there were an awful lot of English folktales from this time about dragons explicitly linked to Norman lords and their families. So here we have an example, Geoffrey of Monmouth. He's writing in the wake of the Norman invasion. He writes this very important text, The History of the Kings of Britain. And an example story that Geoffrey gives us as an explanation for English history, which is largely kind of fictional, it's largely made up. He writes about an ancient king called Vortigern, trying to build a castle at Winchester to create a new lasting peace in England. He's trying to build this castle, but every time he tries at Winchester, the ground shakes and the castle falls down. He can't create peace in England. Why? Well, because under the earth, we're told, there are warring dragons a red dragon and a white dragon. And until their fight is over, there will never be peace in England. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth just kind of makes up this legend. But once again, it is a metaphor because we have these ancient icons in this country. On the left-hand side there, you can see the red dragon of the Brittonic cultures, or the Celts, as some people will call them. But we call these people the Brittonic cultures. They shared a lot of stories, a lot of narratives together, and they did not like the Anglo-Saxons. Their icon was a white dragon. Okay, in the Anglo-Saxon age, we have something called the Heptarchy, a series of different kingdoms that the nation is split up into. And you can see Sussex down there. That's where I am at the very south coast. But then in from that, we have Winchester. So that is the point at which Vortigern's mythical tower was meant to be built. And so what Geoffrey of Monmouth is really talking about is how the Brittonic cultures and the Anglo-Saxon cultures were constantly fighting, like dragons, these ancient primal forces of chaos. So who could come along and subjugate them, subdue them, end this fighting, slay these dragons and bring peace to a unified England? Of course, the Normans can, in the Norman invasion, in their Norman conquest. So effectively, it's a propaganda story. And this kind of idea crops up again and again in English mythology. So this is Durham Cathedral. We have cathedrals, of course, all over England, built by the Normans. This is one of the birthplaces of Christianity in England. It's an incredibly important place in English history, built in this beautiful Oxbow Lake in the north of Britain. It's home to the relics of St. Cuthbert, famously, one of the big important founders of Christianity in England. But if you go into Durham Cathedral and you go into the back, you'll see a very strange thing, which is this sword. Why is this sword there? Well, that sword is the Conyers falchion. It has pride of place in Durham Cathedral. And that's because it is said a Norman lord named John Conyers slayed a dragon in Durhamshire, as it was then known, becoming a local lord. And up and down the country, we have similar stories of noble Norman lords coming in and conquering local dragons. Similar stories occur with giants. Who were these local dragons and giants? Well, very often we know that they're the names of local tribes and populations, local chieftains and leaders, local kings of England, as it was under the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy and under that period of time where, of course, you had the Brittonic cultures kind of keeping to their own businesses to the west coast of England. So the story's pretty clear. We have our metaphor, the idea of sinful old chaotic dragons being conquered by civilizing godly influences. In this case, it's the Normans. And so this is the middle image there is of the Lambton Worm, another famous Norman-related dragon story, where the only way to deal with this dragon, which squeezes everyone it encounters, is for the knight Sir John Lambton to wear spiked armor and go and attack the dragon, who then wraps himself around Lambton and kills himself, effectively. The dragon impales himself on the spikes. And in the north of England, we get writers like, let's say, Lewis Carroll, who grows up in Durham, where his dad works as a priest, and he hears these ancient stories, and he comes up with the image which is salient to the right-hand side picture, which is of the Jabberwocky, a poem that you probably know by Lewis Carroll, which is inspired in part by these much older stories, which might have been quite possibly just made up. But obviously we don't know, and it's nice to believe in dragons, isn't it? It's far more exciting to believe in dragons than not believe in dragons. But what about all these names, if we return to this? Sticky Wicket, the Jaculus, the Cockatrice, the Wyvern, the Basilisk. Well, you know, we've already talked about the idea of our perceptions mutating because of translation, right? So, we take something like the description of Muscsuzu and it becomes something close to the cockatrice. Particularly if you bear in mind this weakness to, weasels and ferrets as translated from the mongoose. Okay, in some versions, Apep, we know, in that case of that dragon, he doesn't have any wings, but he can still fly. So we get something like the Jaculus, which is drawn and described by these monks. We also get something like the Ouroboros, which is a very famous kind of dragon. It bites its own tail. It's a symbol of a perfect circle. It's used to represent cycles of time. But what is the legend of the most famous Ouroboros in Norse mythology, which grows up later than Christian mythology, of course? Well, he's called Jormungandr, and he is a snake who is wrapped right around the world, which is an idea we've obviously heard before with Apep. And when it comes to the end of time, then Jormungandr will wake up, causing an enormous earthquake, and Thor will have to battle him in this initiation of end times known in Norse mythology as Ragnarok. But the point is we have a bit like the Ouroboros going round and round and round, these repeated stories that echo each other again and again and again, and perhaps the echo changes ever so slightly and mutates over time. And in that, really, we have the challenge of translation, of mistranslation, and retranslation, and then the dispersal of ideas through local populations via the oral tradition and later via literature. So if we look at how these words are actually defined, dragon, we've talked about, really just means snake, and that comes from Latin. We've got the Ouroboros, which means the tail eater, that comes from ancient Greek. The Jaculus is the same as a javelin almost. It means thrown, so it's like the dragon has been thrown through the air because it flies. And that is the description we have of those. And the cockatrice means track lever or track follower. That comes from Latin. And you can imagine the sinuous movements of a snake following those tracks. And so we get the cockatrice. And then the basilisk from ancient Greek also literally just means king snake. So the biggest snake there is. So our key ideas to take away, we've got dragons, they're chaotic, and they live in chaotic places. They live in wild places like caves and forests. They're very surprising. They've got something about the eyes to them, something about the teeth to them, and that venom and poison. Dragons as serpents is another key idea, that poisoning and petrifying. We, of course, get the fire breathing from Leviathan, and that is really where that idea enters into the Christian and Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic, we might say, mindset. There are many, many major dragons that are chaos serpents, subdued by sky gods in mythology. That's a story that keeps on happening. And over time, that becomes this idea of lesser evils subdued by civilizing forces like the Normans in England with their invasion. And of course, we've got that daddy story, really, when it comes to serpents and being tricked and being betrayed. So that's probably the most salient example, is the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Satan or Lucifer, a sinful agent of chaos, commonly also portrayed as the great red dragon. An idea that we can link via Leviathan right the way back to the very first dragon in literature, Muscsuzu, the red dragon, who, I think it's important we all remember, he's only a river. So let's try not to hold that against him. And there we are. I think that you are muted, Rochelle.
I'm sorry, I was there for a minute.
That's okay.
Does anyone want to come off mute and ask a question? Nicole Rosa says, this has been fabulous.
Oh, well,
learned so much. Thank you.
Oh, that's such a pleasure. I'm really glad. I mean, one of the things about dragons as a topic is you can kind of talk about them all day because, I slightly addressed the Chinese dragon. And we know, for example, that the Chinese dragon is associated with the various emperors of China. They're believed to have dragon blood, for example. But if you start to look at the Pacific nations a little bit more broadly, start to look at Japan, for example, and their dragon mythology, or the Aboriginal Australians, they have their own distinct mythology, likewise in India. So sort of the Eastern dragon is a whole other topic compared to the medieval dragon that we think of as kind of our Western dragon on the basis of our dragon.
Martin, we had a couple questions about your podcast. Would you remind us of how we can connect to your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll show you the logo again, and also Eleanor, because she's far more appealing than I am.
She's lovely.
Oh, she's great. She's tops. There we are. So it's called the Three Ravens Podcast, and you can find every episode on YouTube. Not that many people listen to it on YouTube, but on all good podcast apps, if you just search for the podcast, you can also stream it from our website, which is threeravenspodcast.com. But we got some happy news about the podcast today, which is that we're now in the top 100 fiction podcasts in the UK, which is a massive achievement for us, considering Eleanor and I only launched the podcast last March. So we haven't been going that long, but it's proven to be a bit of a hit and really popular with a certain type of person. And when I say a certain type of person, I mean people who are interested in silly stories about myth and folklore and history and understanding how sometimes history can end up strangely mutated into something more interesting, perhaps spooky, perhaps a ghost story, perhaps a monster that lives in the woods or an ogre that's under the bridge. But actually, when you peel all that stuff away and look underneath it, there's very often a kind of a logical explanation to it. So that's part of what the podcast's about.
Marvelous. Last
I
chance for questions?
yeah, I had a quick question. Hi, Martin. Really enjoyed the presentation. I had to pop in and out, so you may have answered this, so I'm sorry if you did. Couple questions. First, how did you first get interested in mythologies and dragons and all sorts of stuff like that? And secondly, do you have a favorite depiction of a dragon in folklore or movies or video games or anything?
Okay, well, in terms of how I got interested in folklore, I remember when I was a fairly little boy, I would have been about 5 or 6, my parents for Christmas bought me a book called the Usborne Book of Ghosts. It was part of the World of the Unknown series. And they were sort of looked like educational books, a bit like encyclopedias, and they were full of folktales and stories. But I don't think my parents had opened it because the illustrations inside these books are famously terrifying, spooky, violent, all sorts of people beheaded and demon dogs and all sorts of terrifying things. But they're all myths and legends from around England. And from that point in time, sort of reading the book under my covers at bedtime, I just became completely inspired and ensconced and span out from there to look at encyclopedias. I was one of the kids back in the day who thought encyclopedias were really cool and went, I'm going to look up extra about that in my encyclopedia. But ever since, I've sort of taken an interest in folklore and history and where things come from and the history of ideas, really, I guess you'd call it. In terms of my favorite dragon is a very, very difficult question. I think one of the most important ones, I could talk about many examples, but probably one of the big ones is from Beowulf. If people are familiar with Beowulf, it's a text that's split into 3 parts about this warrior called Beowulf. In his early manhood, he battles a creature called Grendel. And Grendel is kind of a doppelganger or an opposite to Beowulf. He's about overcoming ideas like sin and avarice. And he battles Grendel when he's young. Then he battles Grendel's mother, and we can see in Grendel's mother the idea of sins of the flesh and those kinds of things that monks are also a little bit wary of, and I think we probably all should be to a certain degree. But then in his later stages, as an old man, Beowulf is the rich and successful king. And at the point in time where he's rich and old and all-powerful, and he's kind of done all he can for his people, he ends up having to battle a dragon. And that dragon, in a way, represents what a bad king is. So the dragon hoards gold, is spiteful, is vengeful, is keen to seek revenge. And what Beowulf does at the end of that poem, spoilers, yeah, but it has been around for over 1,000 years, is Beowulf decides, well, I've made use of my life in the best way that I possibly can. The only way I can defeat this dragon is by sacrificing myself. And so in a sense, there's a kind of Jesus analog, I guess you could say, in what Beowulf does, sacrificing his life. But it ties into Stoic ideas about sacrificing for others and giving to others being an important aspect of what makes us human. And it's one of the three fundamental forms of love. You know, you've got desire and love, and you've got filial love, friendship, and then you've got sacrificial love, the love you'd have for your children or your people. And so the idea of that dragon representing all those kinds of sinful, bad behaviors of not being kind to others and just looking out for yourself and being spiteful and vengeful, and Beowulf going, well, this is wrong. I'm happy to give my life in battle of that metaphor and show through leadership what it means to give up a life for the greater good. I mean, I think that's a pretty powerful dragon story as it goes.
Martin,
Fantastic. Thank you.
we have one last question from Carolyn, who would like to ask, do you know of any dragon forms in Native American folklore?
I have to say, Native American folklore is a bit of a weakness for me. I know a little bit about it because I've done a little bit of research into wild men, as we call them, woodwose in this country. So the Sasquatch, Bigfoot, things like that. But I couldn't say any kind of Native American dragon tales off the top of my head. But the Aborigines of Australia, there is kind of a very interesting example. Their belief in their kind of creator god is the rainbow serpent. And the rainbow serpent lives in the sky. It's quite unlike every other dragon myth because the rainbow serpent isn't angry or vengeful. When she is upset with human actions, she will make a storm in the sky. But most of the time, she goes around bringing sunshine, bringing rain, fertilizing the world, and people are very thankful to the rainbow serpent. And it is a long-held belief in Aboriginal Australian or Australasian mythology that when she's happy, you will see her in the sky because that is when there is a rainbow. So that is the rainbow serpent up in the sky, showing you that you've done a good job.
Awesome. Martin, thank you so much for being our special guest on this episode of Aero Senior Living Legend Chasers. As a big dragon fan myself, I had a blast. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. And pass along our gratitude for your time to your lovely partner. And we will be listening to you on your podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope you enjoy it and do stay in touch. We love to hear from people. So do message us, send us emails. We'll definitely say hello and give you a shout out on the podcast. And thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.